And I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank you everyone for coming. See quite a few attendees. This is if you're um, should be here for the North Star Visitor Use Management survey update and report. So a little bit of background, just to remind folks that the North Star Nature Preserve Management Plan does get updated on 5-year intervals and has since 2015. So we have a planned update in 2025. So welcome January, and as one of the management actions identified in the most recent 2020 management plan for North Star, we have completed a visitor use management study by the DJ&A team. It's a team of consultants that are here today to present their findings. So this is a timeline of the management planning process that we foresee ahead of us this year. Simultaneous to the visitor use management study, we engaged Chris Mont from Utah State University and now consulting as well to conduct a third-party review of the ecological components of North Star, specifically the ecological monitoring program and adaptive management for ecological protection. So he'll also present some preliminary findings today. The visitor use management study presentation, the same one you'll see today, was recently provided to the Open Space and Trails Board. And today marks the true beginning of our public engagement process as we update this management plan for North Star. So that's the first star you see on our timeline. This timeline is available on our website, where you can also read and sign up for emails to track our progress through the year ahead. So all the stars indicate meetings that are open to the public. And an important thing to note here is that there's opportunities for public and partner input both prior to the development of the draft plan, right? So we don't have a draft plan yet. We're collecting information now. And then again, after we develop a draft plan, there will be another time for engagement and input. So go ahead to the next slide, please. And this is one of our more intensive plan updates that includes a lot of steps and components as we seek to be as thorough as possible. And this slide is a graphic representation of all those components that will feed into the plan update itself. So we have, laws and policies, different jurisdictions across the North Star area. The plan is really for those parcels that are owned and managed by Pickens County Open Space and Trails, but there are conservation easement requirements within that. Also, existing regulations and actions that have been taken from previous management plans. And then all of, many years of ecological data and reports and monitoring. And on top of that, we'll add in the ecological review from Chris Montz, the visitor use study, other available data practices. And then these purple squares here, anything in purple represents an opportunity for public engagement. So it will have, while the visitor use study did engage the public, we will have broader public surveys and input as well to catch people that were not just river users, as well as partner and working group input. So today is really focusing on the visitor use study. This is a really important step. Specifically, it's providing Open Space and Trails with a new level of data to guide our management of the preserve. So with this data, we can work toward defining more clear desired conditions, management recommendations, and thresholds for North Star. So the study results that we're seeing today are not intended to deliver a specific carrying capacity number or management directive. It's really intended to give us data from which we as a community and as land managers can make more informed decisions about what to manage towards socially and ecologically, and it'll help us clarify the desired conditions that we seek in terms of visitor experience and ecological condition. So you'll get a big tour of that data today from the experts themselves. Next steps will include facilitated focus group meetings with key partners, public surveys, as I mentioned, to dig into all of this data more. There's a lot of information. And the working group will really help us dig into this quite a bit in the near future. So that working group will represent a diverse set of interests related to North Star Nature Preserve, including land managers, partner organizations, the East of Appleton Caucus, some neighbors, Wildwood School, commercial operators, public users, as well as an open space and trails board liaison. So that working group will be convening soon to really dig into a lot of this data because you'll see there's a lot to unpack and understand and balance with as we look forward to how to manage this area. So the only other thing I will say before I pass it off to the consultant team is we do have quite a bit of time allotted at the end for questions and answers. We want to have your questions be answered by the folks who were out there and have dug into this data themselves. So please, if you have questions throughout, you can enter them into the Q&A button at the bottom. That's how we'll be sort of taking questions from you all, and that way we can try to lump together certain themes or just make sure everybody's questions get answered. So again, when you have questions, use the Q&A button at the bottom. We'll be monitoring that. And with that, I'll pass it off to Steve Lawson to introduce the DJNA team.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Liza. Much appreciate that. And I do apologize. I'm going to take just a moment here to try to reload the share so that the slide deck is situated in a way that works a little better than it does right now for me to speak with all of you. So just bear with me here for a moment, if you would, please. Okay, can you see the slide deck in regular view, Liza?
Yes, we see the whole slide deck.
Okay, let me flip it over to presenter view, and then I'll just need to swap screens. Do you now see the slide deck in presenter view?
Yes, that looks great.
Amazing, thank you. Thanks for bearing with me on that for a moment. And thanks again, Liza, for kicking us off. And like Liza said, my name is Steve Lawson. I'm a senior project manager at DJNA. We are a research planning and design firm with a focus on parks and other public land recreation areas. And we are prepared to talk to you today about the North Star Nature Preserve Visitor Use Management Project that Liza mentioned as a core component, one of the key components of the overall process for updating the North Star Management Plan here in 2025. And so I'm excited to do that with all of you here. In terms of timing, there was a question about what to expect in terms of timing. I anticipate we will present pretty much up to the top of the hour, which then leaves us for up to an hour for Q&A. And we'll do our best here to hold to that timeline, and really are eager and interested to hear your questions and have a discussion with you. So with that, let's jump in. So the objectives for our presentation today are outlined here, and they include, first and foremost, providing you with an overview of the North Star Visitor Use Management Project's context, purpose, and components. And so really just sort of setting the table before we get into some of the deeper levels of detail from there. And then we will then journey into some details, including a presentation and discussion of the methods and results of the 2024 on-site visitor use management study that we conducted over the summer of 2024. We have a component of the presentation focused on providing you with some preliminary insights and findings from an external peer review of the ecological monitoring that's been going on in the preserve. So we have some time in the presentation for that. And then we'll review next steps and timing, which is largely reminding you of those process steps that Liza just walked us all through here a few moments ago. So that's what we're up to today in terms of presentation. A little bit more of an introduction. So DJ&A, who the heck is DJ&A? Like I said, we're a consulting firm with a focus on parks and outdoor recreation areas, research, planning, and design. I lead our integrated transportation planning and visitor use management consulting services, which is kind of a mouthful there. And we have a small, very niche team that works with me on that program of work, including Abby Larkin, who is a senior transportation planner and visitor use analyst. She has a PhD in park and wilderness management from the State University of New York School of Forestry. And she's been working with me for about 7 years now. And then Annie Engen, who is a transportation planner and visitor use analyst as well. She and I have been working together for about 6 years, and the three of us have therefore been working together for about 6 years. And Annie has a bachelor's degree in mathematical economics from Colorado College. Annie's based in Boulder, Colorado. Abby's in Burlington, Vermont, and I'm in Etna, New Hampshire, but we technically all report out of DJ&A's Lakewood, Colorado office. And I have been doing work for about 25 years now with a focus on visitor use management and user capacities for parks and public lands. Initially, I was in academia. I was a tenured associate professor in the School of Natural Resources at Virginia Tech, and I taught and did research on these topics. I parlayed my research program at Virginia Tech into a consulting practice to move back to my beloved Northern New England about 15 plus years ago, and have been doing that since. The map here illustrates the places where I and the team have either individually or collectively done visitor use management work in North America. I've led projects in every region of the U.S. National Park System, national forest sites throughout the country, local, regional, and state parks and public lands as well. And our work, our areas of expertise are outlined here and include field-based recreation use and user capacity studies, like the study we did with Pitkin County here in 2024, and that we're going to talk about. Similarly, our expertise are in visitor use management strategies and plans, which is also a component of the work we're doing together. Developing visitor use monitoring plans and protocols designed to have projects like this one here, the life of the project to continue on beyond the research project itself and into the future. And we do a lot of work on staff, stakeholder, and public engagement, specifically in the context of visitor use management for parks and protected areas. So that's a little bit about DJ&A and who we are. And then I want to introduce more broadly the project team for this North Star Visitor Use Management Project, which includes the DJ&A folks I just introduced you to, as well as Chris Mons, who is a longtime colleague of mine. Chris and I have been working together in parks and protected areas for just about the full 25 years that I've been involved in this work, and it's been just a pleasure working with Chris. We have very complementary expertise. Chris is a recreation ecologist, and he can tell you more in a little bit about what that all means. And then Melissa Bade from CDR Associates, based in Boulder, Colorado, who helped get us kicked off today and is a community engagement specialist and will be working with the team through the course of the engagement components that Liza had outlined earlier. So that's a little bit about who you are meeting with today. And now let's talk a little bit about the context for the North Star Visitor Use Management Project, which is a mouthful, so the project. And the graph that I've got here on this slide really says a lot in terms of the context for this project and illustrates recreational river use or visitation trends to the North Star Preserve over the last several years. And there's a few things of note in this figure here. Among other things, since 2018, there's been a 50% increase in overall annual river use to 2024. And in that same time period, there's been a doubling of commercial use. Within that broader trend, it's harder to ignore the very bold bar in the graph in 2020. And like we've seen in parks and protected areas, in all of the places we work and throughout the US and North America, a real spike in visitation during the COVID period when people really flocked to the outdoors as a safe space to enjoy themselves with a little bit of social distance. So that's a data point that we are very familiar with seeing. It's important to note that there's a number of factors that go into helping to understand and explain these visitation trends. There's, of course, the popularity and growing popularity of the place in the river recreation activities themselves. There's potentially population growth within the Roaring Fork Valley that are factors, but then the data are hard to ignore based on Pitkin County's previous work on the relationships and the dependence between water levels, fluctuating river levels, fluctuating seasonal weather patterns, and river use. So it's really, there's a whole series of factors involved here, but the trends here are an important part of the context for the project that we're working on here. Related to those trends and part of the project context as well are those visitation trends have raised some questions and potential concerns about potential impacts in the North Star Preserve and surrounding area to ecological conditions and visitor experiences in the preserve itself. How are those visitation levels and trends playing out in the preserve with respect to ecological conditions, with respect to the quality and character of visitor experiences? These are questions that those trends definitely raise. And then questions about traffic and parking conditions within the preserve itself and surrounding the preserve. And so given that context for the project, the purpose of the project in the broadest terms is to provide a data-driven basis and an inclusive process to, one, assess current recreational river use conditions and potential impacts, and two, help Pitkin County Open Space and Trails evaluate and develop visitor use management components for the 2025 North Star Nature Preserve Management Plan. So that's really what we're up to in this project. Given that context and purpose, we have several components, more specific components to the project to help operationalize that purpose and make some progress on it. Those components include an on-site study of recreational river use and users. That's the 2024 study that we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into today. A second and closely related component is visitor use management analysis and recommendations. So leveraging the data from the on-site study, we're doing a lot of work to understand those data, look at relationships and patterns, and from all of that, develop some recommendations for consideration on the VUM components for the management plan update. A third component that Chris Mons is going to speak to a little bit later here is his external peer review of the ecological data and monitoring methods that Pitkin County Open Space and Trails is using in the North Star Preserve. And so those three components are, it's hard to completely tease these out as separate, but those are really, in my mind, the quote data-driven components. And then there are engagement components to the project, including this webinar we have today. And the other elements that Liza spoke to earlier, including an in-person public meeting, Melissa and I will be working with OST to plan, facilitate, and document that. And then in-person working group meetings. And again, Melissa and I will be working with OST and folks to conduct that work. So those are the primary components of the project. So moving from the broad to the more specific, let's dive into the on-site study. And so we'll get a little bit more into the details here. So as I mentioned, the DJ&A team, so Abby, Annie, Steve, that I introduced earlier, worked with OST to design and conduct on-site visitor use management study during the summer of 2024. The data collection period or sampling period for that was from June 22nd through July 28th. We collected data on Wednesdays through Sundays and gave the team Monday, Tuesdays off. And they're using the term components again here. There were multiple components to the on-site study itself. And those include a survey of recreational river users. So we worked with OST to write a questionnaire. We leveraged previous survey research that we've conducted in parks and public lands nationwide in similar types of project contexts and for similar types of project purposes, adapted to the particulars of the North Star Preserve and the needs of OST, and designed to look at some different categories of information, including personal, group, and trip characteristics of folks who float the river during the summer, crowding perceptions and tolerances of those recreational river users, and their attitudes about management options, specifically visitor use management options. So that's a core component of the study, and we're going to look closely at some of the results of that. Additionally, during the study period, June-July study period, our team collected vehicle traffic counts on Wildwood Lane using a automated traffic counter, a radar-detected traffic counter, and we conducted observation-based parking counts at several of the parking areas in the North Star Preserve area. And over here on the right, I apologize, I maybe should have mentioned this first, but this is a map of our study area. And it's always a little bit upside down in my head because the put in is down here and you float to the takeout here. So the kind of trip sequence goes from bottom to top. But again, we had a traffic counter deployed here on Wildwood Lane. That's the green dot here. Parking counts are represented with this dark blue. So we did parking counts at the Wildwood put-in itself, at Southgate, at the beach access parking area, at North Parking, at the pullout between North Parking and the pedestrian bridge takeout, and at the pedestrian bridge loading zone itself and the adjacent roadside. We also, as part of the study, conducted river use volume counts, and that was essentially leveraging Pitkin County's ongoing monitoring program, which includes a game camera that's deployed right here that Pitkin County has been using for several years now to monitor and record river use volumes. And so that was a key data source in the study. And then crowding counts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by crowding counts in just a moment here. But this lighter blue dot illustrates where those crowding counts on the river were taken. So those are the components of the study. A little bit more about those crowding counts. We used a metric that we refer to as people per viewscape, or PPV. And if you're in the discipline of visitor use management and user capacities, that's a very, very familiar acronym. In other words, otherwise it might be a little weird. It might actually make you think of people per vehicle, like an occupancy metric. But in this context, we're referring to people per viewscape as an indicator or measure of crowding. And the idea of a people per viewscape metric is, and how it was applied in this project is we worked together with OST and a professional photographer to select a section of the Roaring Fork River that we thought was visually representative of the experience of floating the river through the preserve. And as it turns out from our collective work and thinking and workshopping together, this image that you see here is the viewscape that we selected as a representative view of the joy of floating the Roaring Fork through the preserve. And so that's our viewscape. And then the people per viewscape are the people, as you might imagine, that you can see and can count up, which makes it a monitor, something you can monitor and a metric. The number of people who are in that viewscape at the moment that you look at the viewscape and make the count. And so in this case, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 people in the viewscape. So this condition would be 4 ppv. In the study, we measured current ppv conditions by way of a game camera that was positioned about where this photo was taken to capture this very same viewscape. And it was programmed to take a picture, I believe it was every 10 minutes, but on some fixed interval quite regularly. So we were getting observation after observation after observation around the clock of ppv in this portion of the river as representative of what visitor use conditions on the river were like during the study period. We also use the ppv variable in the survey of visitors to ask them about their crowding tolerances. How many can you see in this viewscape while you are floating and not feel crowded? So this is a really instrumental variable in the study overall. It's got a ton of precedent in some of the highest stakes visitor use management plans and programs in the country and specifically in the US National Park System. And so it has a lot of precedent. Okay. From methods into some results, let's take a look at what we've learned from this study. And so we'll start here with survey results. And we asked, let's see, I'm sorry, the survey we administered to folks at the North Star Pedestrian Bridge takeout after they had had the opportunity to experience the river itself and all of the shuttling and parking and everything else that goes along with that. So they had just had an experience of this system, and we wanted to ask them about it. And so we asked them what type of group they floated the river with. And we invited people to check more than one option here. We learned from that a majority, a little over half of respondents floated the river with family, and nearly half floated the river with friends. Not terribly surprising. Few floated the river alone, less than 10%, or in other types of groups, which was less than 5%. And by other types of groups, those who did check other type of group, we asked what type of group, and it's typical other types of groups might be a church group, a Boy Scout or Girl Scout group, or other group of that nature. In this case, there were just a few responses, and they were more along the lines of with my boyfriend or with my girlfriend and things like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of additional information to unpack there. We asked how many people were in the group that they floated the river with. We asked about number of adults in the group and number of children. And a majority of groups floated the river in groups with 2 or 3 adults. About 1 in 5 floated the river in groups with 4 adults. And smaller shares floated alone or with groups of 5 or more. About half of the groups, half of the river users we contacted floated in a group with kids, and about half didn't. So just about evenly split there. And by children, we define that as under 18 years of age. We asked our survey respondents what type of transportation they used to access the river for their float that day. And a majority, a solid majority, reported that they used their personal vehicles to access the river. About 1 in 5 used a commercial shuttle to access the river, and few reported other modes. We asked survey respondents where they launched onto the river for their float, and a majority, 3/4, said that they launched at Wildwood. Quite a bit fewer launched at Southgate or another location. And, not entirely surprisingly, some folks just weren't sure. And that was a perfectly legitimate response.
Steve, while you're changing slides, I see a couple of folks have their hands up. Just want to remind folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box on the chat. We're tracking those and answering kind of as they come up if we can. If not, at the top of the hour, we're going to switch to a Q&A portion where we'll get to talking about all of these questions. So just want to just remind people that that's there as you have questions throughout the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. And I'm glad there's some questions. That's great. So let me just flip back here again for a moment. So we learned from the survey, a majority, 3/4 launched at Wildwood, far fewer at the other locations, a few not sure. And so as you recall, we did traffic counts at Wildwood. So we're curious, what do the traffic volumes look like at Wildwood where the large majority of visitors are launching onto the river? What's that looking like traffic wise? And this look at the traffic data should be caveated by the fact that all of you folks know that recreational river use is not the only source of traffic on Wildwood Lane. And so we are not able to tease out from the radar detected traffic counts trip purpose, so to speak. And so these counts include those traveling on Wildwood Lane to access the river for recreation, as well as those maybe going to the school or to residences or some other purpose. And we have plotted here the traffic count data from the month of July. You can see there's a couple of dates where we don't have traffic reported, and that's because of equipment malfunction or a gap in swapping out a battery. And these gray bars that are in the background represent weekends, and the white background are weekdays. And the green, just to orient you a little further to the figure, those are the dates when we were doing the other types of data collection as well. So the parking counts, the survey, et cetera. And so you can see that there's a bit of a weekend pattern to river use, particularly the deeper you get into July. The weekends have a little bit more of a pronounced traffic pattern to them. And during the mid to late July, those traffic volumes were to the tune of 100+ vehicles during the hours of 9 a.m. to essentially 7 p.m. And just to clarify, these are vehicles traveling inbound on Wildwood Lane, so off of the highway and inbound to the Wildwood Lane area. So that's what the daily volumes look like in the month of July 2024. And then we also looked at kind of hourly patterns of traffic. Average or mean hourly traffic by day of week type, so weekend versus weekday, and direction of travel, so inbound versus outbound. And the blue lines represent the weekend data, the pink or purple represent the weekday. The solid lines are the inbound off of the highway and inbound into the Wildwood area. The dashed represent outbound from Wildwood out onto the highway itself. And so some interesting things to look at here. Among other things, overall weekend traffic during the study period was generally higher than weekday traffic on Wildwood Lane, inbound and outbound wise. Both weekdays and weekend days, there's a pulse or a peak of activity during the 10 a.m. average. And again, these are averages, so on average. And then on weekdays, after the 10 a.m. sort of pulse, things remain steady through most of the rest of the day till about 4 in the afternoon, when things start to tick down into the evening. On the weekends, from that 10 a.m. pulse of inbound traffic, things remain a little steady or stable. And then there's another push into the 1 p.m. hour, and then gradual, sort of steady to maybe gradual decline through mid-afternoon, and then more of a drop through the end of the afternoon and into the evening. So back to the survey results themselves then. We asked people, I'm sorry, we didn't ask them how long they floated the river. We asked them about when they started their float. And we used that information plus the time when we conducted the survey to estimate, basically subtract the time we did the survey from the time they said they started, to estimate about how long they were on the river. And we use that to create this plot, which is estimates of river float duration in hours. And from that, about 2/3 of the respondents floated the river for about an hour or two. About 1 in 5 floated the river for 2 to 4 hours. Very immersive experience there. And on average, folks floated the river for about an hour and a half. We asked people about their, what we refer to in the recreation field as experience use history. How frequently have you floated the river in the last 12 months? It's a tricky question in that we have in there, whether you ask it as how many times in the last 12 months, including today, or how many times in the last 12 months other than today, that can trip, that part of it can trip people up. And you can see that here because we had some people, even though we said including today, how many times in the last 12 months, we got some zeros. So there's definitely some margin of error in this one, and that's okay, because what we're doing here is sort of grouping the results into 3 kind of user types, so to speak. And so we see in the data here about 2/3 of respondents were first time, or what we'd think of as infrequent river users. About 1/3 were what we, sort of categorized as moderately regular or regular river users. So that's this somewhere between 3 and 19 times in 12 months. You could make a case that this is more than just regular. But then we had 5% were what we referred to as super users. These are the folks who are reporting 20 plus in 12-month period. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor of what the types of river users out there. We asked respondents what were the primary motivations for choosing to float the river today. Why are you doing this? And we had a variety of different potential reasons for that relate to reasons why people tend to choose to spend time in nature and participate in outdoor recreation. The results of that question suggest that by far the most important reasons for floating the river were to enjoy the natural scenery, enjoy time with friends and family, and to immerse themselves in the river environment. And that's interesting in and of itself. And it's also a good reminder of all of the great things that come from people spending time engaging in activities like this and in places like this. There's some real genuine, meaningful benefits to spending time in nature and participating in outdoor recreation. And some of that comes through here. Gets me excited. We asked people about their river trip planning. How far in advance did you decide that you would float the river today? And we asked this for a variety of reasons, but one is in the context of visitor use management strategies. And one of the strategies that is often considered and applied in visitor use management is providing advanced trip planning information about things like leave no trace practices, what to expect in terms of parking conditions, visitor use levels, information about other options if what is happening at North Star may not meet your expectation, blah, blah, blah. And so to the extent people are planning at least somewhat in advance, they maybe are a captive audience for some advanced trip planning information. If they're deciding spur of the moment, that's a bit of a tougher job to pull off. So what did we find out here? About half of respondents decided to float the river within a week of their float. So, you know, a somewhat captive audience for that pre-trip planning info. About a third decided on the same day of their float. So that's a tough crowd to try to give them information in advance of being there on site. And about 1 in 5 decided a month or more in advance. And that's a very captive audience for some advanced trip planning information. What sources of information did folks use? And we asked people, did you feel like you had the information you needed? Nearly everybody said, yes, I felt like I had the information I needed to plan my float. And I used primarily personal knowledge. 3/4 said that. Other people they know, so who had been on the river, a weather forecast, and river level forecast. So those are the primary sources of information people said they used to plan their trip, if any information at all. And then the other info sources we listed, not too many people indicated they were using those. Other things we learned about the characteristics of recreational river users during summer 2024, nearly all were US residents. The vast majority self-identified as white or Caucasian. 3/4 are 49 years of age or younger. 2/3 residents of Colorado, and a little over half have an annual household income of $100,000 or more. We also were curious, the project team in the residents of survey respondents, river users. We asked if folks had a primary or secondary residence in the Roaring Fork Valley, or if they were not a resident of the Roaring Fork Valley. Public rather than versus commercial river users were more likely to have a primary or secondary residence in the valley. The majority of public users were primary residents. And then interestingly, commercial users were more likely than public users to have a secondary residence in the valley. Diving deeper into their experience, we asked them if they felt crowded at any point during their river float. And we parsed these results out for weekends and holidays versus weekdays under the premise that use levels likely and in fact were higher on weekends. And we found that river users were more likely to feel crowded on weekends and holidays than on weekdays. On weekends and holidays, about 1/4 felt crowded at some point during their trip. And what's interesting, if you look here, parking and or unloading in the parking lot, at the takeout, about 1/4 on weekends, and lower percentages once launching and on the river itself. And the same pattern was observed for weekdays, which suggests that crowding was more common unloading and taking out than while launching or floating on the river itself. Diving deeper into the question of visitor use levels and crowding, we return to the PPV indicator or metric that we talked about earlier. And we had a question in which we showed each respondent a set of 5 photo simulations that depicted varying numbers of people in the viewscape that we selected as representative of floating the river. And each respondent was shown 5 photos, and those photos had varying numbers of people. And for each photo, we asked, if you were floating the river and saw this many people on the river, would you feel crowded? Yes or no? Real simple, yes or no. And so, for example, we might have showed them this photo. Would you feel crowded? How about this? 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 Would you feel crowded? And so we summarized the responses to those questions in this chart that we have here. And there's some really interesting information in here. And so each bar corresponds to a PPV level. So this is this bar corresponds to the photo that had one person in the viewscape, two people in the viewscape, three people in the viewscape, all the way to a max photo sim with 30 people in the viewscape. And we can see that when there are 3 or fewer people in the viewscape, very few respondents reported that they would feel crowded floating the river with that. These would be your most crowding sensitive folks. At 4 ppv, though, you start to get a notable crowding response. Now you've got about a third of respondents saying, yeah, you know what, I would feel crowded. You push up to 6, you're not quite a majority. And at 8 ppv, you start to see a majority saying, yeah, I'd feel crowded. And by the time you get to 12 ppv and beyond, virtually everybody is saying, yeah, I'd be crowded. So this is some really interesting information for us. We used the game camera-based PPV counts to put those survey data into context. So interesting what people think of photo simulations, what's actually going on the river in terms of PPV conditions. And we focus specifically in this graph on peak day use hours. So during those busiest hours of the day, on weekdays in purple and weekends, what are the PPV conditions like? And interestingly, the majority of the counts of PPV on weekends and weekdays were of 0 PPV. About 1/3 of weekend counts were of 1 to 2 PPV, and there were 3 to 4 PPV in 10% of counts on weekends, and 5 or more in 6% of counts. So that gives you some insight into current conditions and in relation to the survey response about various PPV levels. We also played some sort of scenario analysis. If you were to set a threshold as a point beyond which you would enact some management actions, what percentage of the time currently are those thresholds being exceeded? So if you were to set a threshold at managing for no more than 2 ppv in that viewscape on the river, the survey results suggest about 6% would feel crowded, which means virtually most wouldn't. Under current conditions on weekends and holidays, that threshold is exceeded about 15% of the time. On weekdays, less often at 9% of the time. If you were to set it at 4 ppv, about a third would feel crowded based on the survey results. And this, under current conditions, is exceeded just 6% of the time on weekends and holidays during peak hours, and 4% of the time on weekdays, 6 ppv less frequently that those conditions are being exceeded. So that starts to illustrate how you start to put this information together and think about those visitor use management components for the plan. As I noted, we found that crowding was more common at the put-in and takeout, so we looked at parking conditions. Before I dig into that, I'm going to just acknowledge the time here for a moment. I probably will need to go to the top of the hour or cut a little bit of material to hand it over to you, Chris, to then go 10, and then turn it to Q&A. Melissa, I'm curious what you would recommend as meeting facilitator extraordinaire.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of questions about the content, Steve. So I do think it's helpful just to give the background. I want to make sure we get to Q&A. So I'd say, at the latest, let's make sure we get to Q&A at quarter after. But it sounds like given
Perfect.
your, initial.
I think that'll work. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So great. Thank you. Again, we learned from the questions about crowding that crowding was more common at the put-in and takeout than on the river itself. So what do those parking areas look like? We did observation-based counts of the number of vehicles parked in each of the locations I pointed out earlier. And we did those on an hourly circuit. So once an hour, we looked at Wildwood and we did a count, how many cars parked. Then we moved to Southgate, how many cars parked, then down to the next and the next and the next. And so each hour we got a parking count at each of the 5 or 6 parking locations. Those counts are summarized in these figures here. The gray lines in the background represent the hourly counts on each of our data collection days themselves. The solid lines are weekends, the dashed lines are weekdays, and then the blue lines are mean values across those sampling days. And so you can see at Wildwood, during the mid-afternoon in particular, the number of cars parked in the parking lot can exceed the designated capacity for that area, which is represented by this horizontal line. So there is pressure, particularly on weekends, on the parking resources at Wildwood. That's how to look at and interpret and think about these figures. On average, parking pressure approaches but doesn't exceed the capacity at Wildwood. There was at least one weekday and another one here where we did observe that happening. At the takeout end of the system, we wanted to look there. And so folks who stage a car for the river shuttle on the takeout end of things are parking at North Parking Lot or on Highway 82 in the pull-off area there. And you can see that later in the afternoon, as you might expect, you start to see parking pressure in these locations. There's just one day during the sampling period, it was a weekend day, when the number of cars parked at North Parking Lot exceeded this designated capacity for the lot. We see more pressure at Highway 82, also in that late afternoon period. We did counts again of vehicles parked in the 10-minute loading area at North Star Pedestrian Bridge and any vehicles that were parked on the roadside adjacent. There's 3 spaces for loading there, which is represented by this horizontal. Late afternoon, you start to see some pressure there. But what we want to do is put that in the context of data that were collected. In this picture was taken in 2019 and is in the 2020 management plan. And in this case, there were 30 to 40 vehicles parked in this area. And the actions that Pitkin County has taken since as a function of that 2020 plan really seem to have made some dramatic improvements in terms of the conditions, from having as many to 30 to 40 to what we saw in the study here, where the max we ever observed was 6, is a bit of a success story there. And so just want to take a moment to point that out. I'm going to pop beyond these. Go to respondents' attitudes about visitor use management strategies, including current visitor use management strategies that Pitkin County is using. The results of the survey suggest there's quite a bit of support for current management practices, including managing the size of commercial groups, the number of commercial groups, providing mandatory low impact education to commercial groups, and managing use through limited parking availability. So substantial majority support for all of those strategies. We asked about potential future management strategies, and folks were a little bit more gun shy, so to speak, of change. And all of that, without unpacking the details of these now in the interest of time, the interesting finding here is that support is less forthcoming for potential future visitor use management strategies than for current strategies. And that's just good information as everybody looks to the future and thinks about the management plan update. The key findings I have here really echo things I've already said through the course of the presentation. So I will not take the time to go through those again here so that I can turn the floor over to my good friend, Chris Mons.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Liza, for setting us up well for this whole presentation. With this part of the presentation, I'm going to dive into the ecological monitoring protocols and my peer review of those protocols that I'm in the process of conducting. First, set a little bit of background. Steve mentioned I'm an ecologist by training. I have focused over the last 30 years or so my efforts at working in parks and protected areas to help parks and protected areas worldwide develop sustainable visitor use management strategies to minimize ecological disturbance and to provide benefits via outdoor recreation. I've partnered a lot with Steve and his teams over the years on various studies, and I'm happy to be working with Pitkin County as I have in a number of projects over the last couple of years. First, what I've done in this process is looked at all of the monitoring protocols that have been used by Pitkin County and the guiding documents, including land management plans, over the last 15 to 20 years, and looked at them through the lens of my background and the background that the federal agencies use in order to develop monitoring protocols for ecological sustainability. There's some key elements that I've been looking for, and these dovetail a lot into some of the work that Steve just presented with the ideas that translate into visitor use monitoring and management. So first of all, I've looked for some important elements such as the development of desired conditions, what the areas are being managed for, specific measurable metrics or indicators of those conditions, details of protocols with appropriate quality control and quality assurance methods, and an element of integration into an overall management process, often articulated in management plans. What we oftentimes refer to that as indicator-based adaptive management, which is really the state of the art in terms of park and protected area management. You can move to the next slide, Steve. Okay, so we're going to fly at about 30,000 feet here with this in deference to time. So I want to go through a couple of the things in broad brush that I've found, and of course, I'd be happy to address any specific questions as we get into the discussion. First, desired future conditions, which are an important basis for any kind of monitoring and management. In digging through the North Star management plan from 2020, I found the plan to articulate very clearly some aspirational statements that do provide overall and overarching guidance for management and suggest indicators. So there's statements like the first one, the overarching management objective of the North Star Nature Preserve is to allow natural processes to occur and to support ecological resilience. This is a very common way to articulate an aspiration for the conditions on the preserve and suggests a range of ecological indicators that might be monitored as a consequence. Go on to the next one, Steve. Then looking at indicators and protocols, what I found there is over a 25-year history of extensive protocols across a range of different kinds of ecological conditions. There currently are approximately 17 current protocols that have been developed using external expert ecologists, many of whom are very familiar with Colorado ecosystems, and the issues associated with them. They have also articulated very clear, specific monitoring protocols and associated intervals in accord with the management planning process when indicators will be repeatedly measured, looking at trends over time. Some of these indicators are things like hydrologic and geomorphic processes, plant species and vegetation monitoring, particularly looking at invasive species, which are problematic in many places. And last, a wide range of wildlife monitoring, including small mammals, megafauna and birds. So as a consequence, a wide range of indicators have been developed and ecological protocols have been established. Next slide. Not wanting to dig too far into the weeds, but give you an idea of some of the analysis we're doing on this. Looking at the different protocols, here's some examples from the kinds of things that have been developed over the years and breaking it down into some key components of what a quality monitoring protocol would look like. Here we're looking at examples of the avian bird monitoring protocols. Different approaches there are listed on the vertical column on the left-hand side of the screen, and different characteristics that we're looking for a quality monitoring protocol listed on the top line horizontally. And so things like the interval and being very clear as to when those intervals will be repeated, the spatial extent of the monitoring, different kinds of variables measured, and where the most recent data are available. And so this is the kind of analysis that I'm doing across the 17 different protocols and looking at those in detail. Next slide. Last piece is the integration into adaptive management process. First, the figure on the right illustrates the adaptive management process that Pitkin County has used as a basis for their management planning process, which is in accord with adaptive management strategies that have widely been developed over the last 20 years or so. Secondly, provide some examples there on the left of how the adaptive management planning process has been implemented using key findings from monitoring in order to inform management decisions. So, for example, great blue heron protection and management. The observation was made through the data of limited great blue heron nesting sites along the river over the years and a trend towards decreasing nesting sites to limiting the ability of the herons to nest. While no causality is really inferred here, there are some suggestions of things that could be done in order to enhance that habitat. Within the context of these findings, various kinds of management strategies have been implemented, from creating no-fly zones for paragliders, quiet zones for river users, and active protection of the nesting trees and habitat sites. So a clear integration of the monitoring findings into the adaptive management. Last slide. Preliminary conclusions. What I found is a robust and rigorous program of monitoring. I think this represents seriousness of purpose of monitoring and a integration into an adaptive management process, which is all state-of-the-art components when it comes to parks and protected areas. I think there will be some recommendations that'll come out that will help enhance future monitoring in North Star. First are things like clarifying the desired future conditions and associated indicators. As I mentioned earlier, they are embedded in the management plan, and these have been very clearly articulated in the protocols, but could probably be better articulated to the public in the future management plan revision. What goes along very clearly with the indicator-based adaptive management is the development of triggers and thresholds of acceptability, something we also employ in visitor use management, which I think would be very applicable there. Those triggers and thresholds would suggest when ecological conditions approach or exceed those thresholds that a management action should be taking place. Otherwise, again, I found the protocols to be very rigorous and clearly representative of a state-of-the-art process in terms of park and protected area management. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And Melissa, I think that sets us up for Q&A and discussion. And I'll just point out this last slide here includes a picture of the field team that was on the ground collecting the data that we just took a walk through today. And so just want to acknowledge the great hard work of these folks and the organizations that together made the study happen.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve, and Chris, both for great information, and Liza for providing some of the context. Just a quick note on process. I know we've gotten a couple questions in the chat about this, and then I'll get to some of the more targeted ones. So just a few pieces on process is, this is really an opportunity to share with you all as neighbors, as land managers, as operators, as members of the public who are interested, that we are providing this information as kind of a result of the 2020 management plan, right? So there was a request to have more information about visitor use. No decisions have been made on what this means for the 2025 management plan update. So this is really just a snapshot of what kind of, what's happening on site. And this is an informational piece to kind of lead us into the public engagement portion. So we've gotten a couple questions about, how do we use this information? We want to make sure that the neighbors are also heard. And certainly that's kind of this is the jumping point for those conversations. So I appreciate some of you recognizing that, and that, this is the opportunity now to answer some of your targeted questions about the study. And then we're going to kind of go into what's next and what are your additional opportunities to engage. So when I first started talking, there were, I think, 10 questions in the chat. Now there are 17. So it's going to take me a little bit of time to get through them. We've answered a couple of them already. So if you have follow-up questions about those, let us know. You should be able to see any answered questions in the kind of chat. I'm not exactly sure what your view looks like as attendees, but there should be an option to see answered questions. So we tried to get through some of them. Maybe I'll kick off. I'm going to focus first on Steve's portion on the visitor use study, and just ask Steve if you could talk a little bit about, we have a couple questions in here about uses. And so the first one being, there was a question, I think it was specific to what you were talking about at the time, but maybe you could just generally talk about, did you look at, there were paddle boards in the photos, but did you also look at tubing, rafting, canoes, kayaks, etc.? And then also did that look at other uses outside of river use? So whether that's hiking, fishing, jogging, dog walking, etc. So I'll turn that to you and let you answer those couple questions. You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, sure. And Melissa, should I stop sharing at this point, or would it be helpful to
Sure,
keep the?
yeah. Then
Yeah.
folks can see
Okay.
it better.
Let me give that a shot. Have I officially stopped sharing? Okay,
You're
great.
good?
Yeah. So great questions. And so with respect to, I guess, watercraft type, the photo simulations that we used in the survey depicted folks who were paddleboarding and did not have a mix of different watercraft type in it. The approach there is to represent quote unquote typical conditions, which we all know there's no such thing as typical, but it is the case from a conversation with OST last week that roughly 99% of the floating use is paddleboarding use. We did survey folks irrespective of watercraft type and spoke to them. So that's an answer to a part of the question. And then Melissa, was there another part of the question that I did not cover?
I think that's right. So we were talking about uses kind of external to river use, hikers, fishing, jogging, swimming,
Right.
dog
Yeah.
walking, etc.
Yep.
And then, craft that was used. And it sounds like you looked at all the ones that were mentioned: tubes, rafts, canoes, kayaks, etc.
Yeah, and the study was focused specifically on floating use of the river.
Yeah. Great. So the next kind of group of questions that I had were about the PPV calculations. Again, Steve, this is for you. So one question about clarifying the time period that you were using. So, the different, and I apologize, I'm having to scroll to find these questions. But the time period of day, if it was a, high use period, and then the additional question is, I can find maybe the specific one. So here's the time period one. So PPV is a snapshot of users in one spot and feeling overcrowded. The feeling overcrowding is in that specific spot. Isn't the entire float a composite of many snapshots and potentially accumulated feeling of overcrowding? So was that in part of the consideration? And then, this question about what time period are you using? If you're including non-peak hours, for example, that might skew the results lower. So.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, good question. And certainly the river trip is a dynamic experience that quite frankly begins before the river user even ends up on site. And so part of the experience can be thinking about, researching about, deciding and making plans to do the river trip itself. And there are experiential components to that all the way through leaving the site and returning home and reflecting on the experience itself. And so it's a really interesting, complex social psychological dynamic. And it would be unreasonable to suggest that visitors' responses to numbers of people per viewscape in the photo simulations fully and completely and comprehensively captures the entire experience, and we wouldn't suggest that. But what it is it's a model of a key component of the experience and relates specifically to some of the core values of the preserve and recreation use of the preserve itself, and that's that time on the river, floating and sort of in the belly of the river, so to speak. And so that was a way to kind of operationalize a key aspect of the experience and think about it that way. It's also why we asked about perceptions of crowding in other parts of the experience other than on the river itself. So yeah, great question.
Thanks, Steve. And just to follow up on that, if folks see me kind of organizing your questions in the chat, I'm just trying to organize it on my end, so I make sure to get to as many as possible. But a quick follow up on kind of the experience piece and who you're reaching. So the question specifically is it possible that survey respondents were less likely to participate in the survey during the busiest time, since it can be overcrowded at the takeout, and maybe they had to rush to get out of the way of other folks exiting the takeout? Would that mean that we would be missing some important opinions if during the most busy and crowded times?
Yeah, great question. And as part of our survey methodology, we do our best and do so respectfully and diplomatically to get a little bit of information even from people who decline to participate in the survey itself, so that we can do what's called a non-response bias analysis. And so we did try to get a couple of really key pieces of information from those non-respondents, we call them, the people who decline to participate, that we can compare to characteristics of respondents and see if there's something systematically different between respondents and non-respondents. And so we collected 3 or 4 pieces of information about non-respondents from those who are willing to, hey, no worries, understand if you have a minute to just let us know, bing, bing, bing. And if they don't even want to do that, then away they go. But a lot of times they're happy to do just that. And one of those non-response bias questions, as we like to call it, is, did you feel crowded at any point during your trip on the river today? And as it turns out, and kind of emphasizes the astute nature of your question, there was a statistically significant difference between respondents and non-respondents with respect to the question of, did you feel crowded on your float today? And non-respondents are statistically significantly more likely to have said, yes, I felt crowded, than those who did not. And so some of the insights about perceptions of crowding and crowding tolerances, you might think of those or put those in the context of that broader finding, and think of them as maybe kind of lower end estimates of those things. So yeah, great question. That was one of the points in my key findings slide that I chose to pass over in the interest of time. So great question, and we can quantify that and kind of have carefully caveated that as well. The other side of that coin is we did conduct the study purposefully during the peak summer season and on Wednesdays through Sundays. So certainly each weekend during that period, and then the latter half of the weekday, and during hours of the day where we expected there to be relative activity on the river. So we were trying to study the system under peak use conditions. And so that's the other side of the coin. And quite frankly, we would have likely found something interesting and different if we'd conducted the study outside of the peak of the summer season.
Great, thanks. And that actually reminds me, Steve, there was a question towards the beginning around the inclusion or exclusion of August for the counting. And Liza mentioned that river use at North Star in August is lower as the water levels typically drop towards the end of July. So I don't know if you want to speak to that anymore. And also, while you're thinking about that, Steve, that some folks have mentioned in the chat that they're not seeing the questions. So we will also post the full Q&A online. So we're going to capture these questions and post the Q&A online if we don't get to anything. And I'll try to make sure I'm reading out the questions so it's really clear what we're answering for folks. So apologies if you can't see them. Again, I'm not as familiar with exactly what you can see versus what I can see, but we'll make sure that we're really transparent in posting them online. So Steve, any thoughts on the timing selection? Anything more to add there?
Yeah, so we were, again, purposeful in the selection of the sampling period for the study, and among the considerations was wanting the sampling period to coincide with reasonable river flow levels, and to be completed, quite frankly, before that lower flow levels when there's a voluntary closure. So yeah, we did think explicitly about that and made that choice.
Great. I'll just mention one more thing on the visitor use portion, and then we'll get to Chris, some questions directed towards Chris here as well. There are a few questions in the chat about recommendations. So recommending types of commercial use or amount of commercial use, and what consultants would recommend as far as volume goes. And I'll allow Steve to expand on this, but at least, you know, from my perspective in the facilitation space, this, you know, study information was really just informational, and the recommendation portion comes as we're developing the draft management plan. So we're not quite there yet, and that's part of the reason we're gathering community input. Part of the reason we'll have our working group is we want to talk through the perspectives of the neighbors, of the commercial operators, of users of the site, and then use that to inform management recommendations. But Steve, I don't know if you or Liza want to speak more eloquently to that piece.
To be perfectly honest, Melissa, you nailed it. And so I don't have really anything to add to the points that you made there.
Liza, I saw you came off camera. Do you have any further thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think, yeah, this is
Okay.
information to help us all figure it out.
Great. Chris, you came off mute too, so I want to give you an opportunity.
Yes. Well, you know, I think it's very well articulated in the process that, you know, And as Steve will emphasize, the data and the research findings are informative, but not necessarily prescriptive. And it's part of the public process to be able to develop as part of the management plan as we move forward. And that's a good process.
Great. Chris, while you're off mute, we've got a couple of questions on the ecological components.
Yeah, you
And
bet.
so maybe just the first one that came through is if you could speak a little bit more to quiet zones, how they get monitored, no-fly zones, et cetera.
You mean in terms of the great blue heron management piece?
I think that's true. And I'll just mention a couple folks also noted that it sounds like the great blue heron potentially have abandoned their location in this site. So you can maybe speak to that a little bit as well. But the question that specifically came through is how does quiet zone get monitored and no fly zone? So I'm not exactly sure what it's referring to, though I do think it was part of that great blue heron conversation.
Yeah, so there's specifically not a monitoring protocol for no-fly zones and quiet zones. That has been built into a management recommendation that could be advanced within the context of the new management plan and would be appropriate to think about. Things like soundscape are very important in parks and protected area management. They've become more important over the years. And as a consequence, that would be a good thing to consider as those values are more important to folks in a nature-based experience. We also now have a pretty well developed science looking into ecological disturbance as a consequence of anthropogenic noise. And these kinds of things are very important to maintaining a healthy ecosystem. So that would be an important piece to advance, I think, in this current management planning process, if desirable.
And I can just add that some of that is not, there's not a monitoring protocol. There is, however, enforcement from our rangers. So that may be part of the answer as
Yes.
well. It's not monitored, but the rangers do float through the preserve and access areas where that quiet zone exists. That also applies to areas that go through private property where we do not have jurisdiction. So it is a complicated landscape sometimes in terms of regulation, but we can regulate for that. And then as well, I'm not sure if no fly was related to drones, but we do have a regulation with no drones being used over open space properties, and that is also enforced by our ranger team.
Yeah, I may add in reference to the great blue heron situation, their populations are doing well Colorado-wide, but it is possible that the nests in the reserve have been abandoned. I use that example as a good example of the adaptive management process, and where there was a notable change in condition and an effort to return to those conditions. And as a consequence, we may see some change in condition in the future or may remain static in the current situation. But it was a good example of a adaptive management process where there was a response based on the data.
Great. Thanks, Chris and Liza. Couple folks mentioned specific species in their questions. So Chris, just want to kind of get your initial take on, how these are being considered.
Sure.
One is beavers, insects, managing insects along the property. Great blue heron, of course, as I mentioned, was noted as well. And then I thought there was one more, but trout health. So those were a few different species, and curious how those are being considered in the data collection. So trout, insects, great blue heron, and beavers.
Yeah, Liza may need to chime in here. There's currently no fishery monitoring specifically for trout that I'm aware of. Is that the case, Liza?
We just coordinate with Colorado Parks and Wildlife as they manage the waters of the state and the fish within that. They have done trout surveys within North Star. However, it is part of what makes it an attractive place to float is its low gradient, which means the sand settles out. So it's a pretty sandy bottom, which is not actually great trout reproduction habitat. So and they being Colorado Parks and Wildlife does a lot more of their focus work upstream and downstream. But they do stock the Roaring Fork River in and around the Aspen area, influencing the trout populations there as well.
There is aquatic macroinvertebrate sampling and a protocol for that. In terms of beaver, they are monitored within the broad scale of the small mammal populations and associated geomorphological processes to note changes in stream bank and stream condition.
Great. Oh, sorry, I missed this one in my list of species, but elk calving. So curious, there's a question here about whether elk calving has been impacted by river use or whether we've studied any of that information.
Well, the vast majority of North Star is essentially devoid of visitors. And so a lot of the preferred habitat for ungulates would be well away from areas where people are visiting frequently. Specifically, there are various transects to do wildlife monitoring, and there's camera traps, surveys that have been done over the years. In terms of elk calving, I'm not aware that there's a specific protocol for that or that it is calving grounds. Liza might want to chime in on that in terms of those specifics.
Yes, thank you. I think that was well put that, I don't think that the places where elk are calving are overlapping with the corridor between the river and the highway where humans are allowed. That's not an elk production area.
Great.
And we haven't seen impacts. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll also just mention as part of that as well that Colorado Parks and Wildlife will be part of the working group. So it's important to bring that that the county has been working with them to identify someone to be part of those conversations as well, so that we have the wildlife perspective part of the discussions of the working group.
Yeah, an important component of the overall monitoring strategy is to, particularly with wildlife, is to maintain quality habitat so that it has the potential to be a productive wildlife area. Whether they're currently established or not is another question. And that comes out a lot in the transect surveys and camera traps. But I think the important piece of maintaining high quality habitat is paramount.
Great. Okay, I'm just scrolling through. We're getting a couple more questions in. I apologize if I didn't ask specifically about some of these. So just to follow up, there was someone wondering about the insect question. So there seems to be a number of meaningful number of insects on the river. Do we know if there's any mitigation happening for that?
I can take
Liza?
that one in
Yeah.
that insects are an important part of an ecosystem, a critical source of food actually for a variety of avian species. I am looking, I think, if in terms of mitigation, I know that there is a group of homeowners and maybe HOAs that have I think it's a mosquito control district. I don't know who's in charge of it, but I do know that they treat for mosquitoes out there too. So there's, it is not a pristine place in that sense either. So that's what I do know. If anyone knows more about the mosquito control district, I'd actually love to find out more about what's happening out there.
Great. Thanks, Liza. Chris, maybe just to stay with you for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Could you clarify there was some question about the timing of the study. I think there maybe was some confusion in here. Please clarify the study protocols from 2000 to 2024 or only from 2020 to 2025. It seems like maybe the question is around what was the time period that the study was conducted in.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. What I've done is I've looked at the range of protocols that have been developed literally over the decades.
Okay.
And in terms of what has been implemented, there's about a 25-year history of doing ecological monitoring on the reserve. I looked back in time to see those protocols and their development, how they've progressed over time, what's been added, and how that's been part of an overall adaptive management process, which is essentially the role of monitoring. I mean, you can go out and measure things however you want, but it gains a lot of power and importance when it's integrated well into an overall management process. And that really was the goal of the lens that I was looking through in order to determine my best recommendations for being able to advance monitoring as part of a process of maintaining high degree of ecological conditions in the future. Again, there's a long history. Some things were implemented early on, like some vegetation monitoring, for example, that then led to the development of other protocols. There's been a lot of activity in the last 10 years to implement new protocols to advance these ideas within the context, again, of a management process where if change in management is needed, that could be implemented based on the data.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And that actually leads me to the next question. I think that did, by the way, answer the question about timing.
Yeah.
That you looked at a history of decades of information. And, there's a couple questions here. One in particular that you alluded to additional ways to manage use. And there's a question about if you could provide some examples or suggestions of how to manage use, or you could expand on that.
I'm not exactly sure what that is referring to. Broadly, from an ecological perspective, the literature is pretty clear that under high use situations, containment or confinement strategies tend to reduce overall ecological disturbance. There's a long history of experimental work and studies looking at that very issue. And when you look at North Star, that's essentially one of the management strategies that is happening, in that visitor use is confined to a relatively narrow corridor that attracts people and provides an opportunity to experience the reserve area without dispersing across the entire landscape, and as a consequence, potentially proliferating disturbance. Now, having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean that the areas that we are focusing visitor use in that we want to be disturbed excessively. And so that's where some good adaptive management comes in, to be able to allow folks to visit a place with minimal disturbance. Steve mentioned this in his presentation, where he referred to minimum impact and low impact education as being an important component of management. So that's a very general response to the question. If there are, more specifics that we need to talk to, a lot of that dovetails into what Steve presented today as well.
Absolutely. And this question kind of spans, again, both presentations around kind of the natural resources of the area and then in the visitor component. So there's a question in here about safety and in particular kind of interaction with wildlife, moose being one of the animals that were mentioned, and curious if either of you, Steve or Chris, want to talk about safety concerns related to interface with wildlife, visitor management, how to manage that interaction, whether it's moose or otherwise. This particular question was about moose, but do either of you have perspectives on kind of maintaining a high level of safety while also the kind of integrity of natural resources and visitor experience?
I can start. Steve may want to chime in there. We've conducted a number of studies. The one that comes to mind most recently has been up in Grand Teton National Park about visitors interacting with charismatic wildlife in ways that both disturb wildlife and potentially put the visitor in a safety situation. The best intervention there, there's two ways. One, of course, is visitor education and minimum impact education in terms of visitors maintaining safe distances from wildlife. And the second is enforcement. And those need to play an important role in any kind of situation where you're dealing with visitors approaching wildlife, harassing wildlife, improper handling of food, all of the things that we're concerned about when it comes to wildlife and human interaction. So there are multiple means of maintaining both, again, minimum disturbance to wildlife as well as visitor safety. And as a consequence, those things can be employed. I think maybe Liza could chime in as to the number of incidents that may have occurred over the years. I'm not aware of that data, and I'm not sure if any of that has been discussed within the context of this overall management plan revision.
I would have to check with the rangers on a number of incidents, but I do know that there's an adaptive response that when moose are seen and we hear about that in the area, that some temporary signage and additional presence of rangers goes into effect to try to minimize any potential safety concerns. But yeah, it is, again, we're just launching off into the beginning of this planning phase, so that can be a point of discussion for sure.
Great. Thanks, Liza. Steve, anything more to add to that? I saw you nodding your head. Just want to give you an opportunity if you have anything.
I think that point's well covered. Thanks.
Let's see, what other questions? So there's a few kind of longer comments in the chat that we will certainly capture for consideration as we move into the management piece. And others, you know, Liza, Chris, Steve, as you're looking at the Q&A portion, if you see something that we haven't answered, please let me know. There's a question about information in the presentation and whether information was gathered on where the user was from and if they were part of a commercial float versus a personal float. The answer is yes. And I guess I want to pose this, Steve and Liza, are we planning to post? I know we're posting this video. Are we going to post the slides as well for folks to have access to if they want to look through that information?
I'm going to defer to you, Liza, on answering that question.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. We can also talk, there's a written report that the DJNA team is working on finalizing to provide for us. So that will also be, you know, a source with actually more information than just these slides that would be will be available for the public and folks to engage with more.
Perfect. Awesome. And we will, as I mentioned earlier, also we're tracking the questions and comments that are coming into the chat, and we'll be, you know, posting responses to those as well. So we've gotten a couple questions about commercial outfitters and their role in kind of the site and education components of the site. And I guess I'm curious, Liza, maybe if you want to speak to this, to the county's, role of working with commercial outfitters, how they use the site, how you permit for that, just to answer some of these questions around the value that guides add to the management of the property.
Sure. So there's a long history of commercial use at North Star, and it did grow in terms of the number of commercial operators that were allowed at North Star over time. And it's been, I think, an adaptive process of trying to figure out how those the balance and tension between encouraging people to go to North Star versus the benefit of having them go with good stewards of the river, and how to find a good balance between that. Most recently, the number of commercial operators was reduced, not necessarily the use. I don't have those numbers. But I can, if there's specific questions, type those into the chat and we can find the right people to get those answers. But I think in general, it is a way to keep that allows people to access North Star in a way that either makes them feel safe or provides more education and whatnot. But there was a request. I'm not super familiar with the process of permitting and determining numbers, so I'm gonna pass on that one. But again, please, if you have specific questions, put them in the Q&A, and I can find folks to provide those answers, and everyone will be able to see those answers.
Great. Thanks, Liza. Yeah, I was going to mention that too, is as we get into this public engagement portion, that's a great opportunity to talk about commercial use and how that's part of the plan moving forward and what that looks like. Okay, I see just maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and I want to give a little bit of time for us to wrap up the presentation. Thanks to everyone for sticking on, and maybe just quickly, Steve, as part of the visitor use portion, curious if there was information I know that you focused your collection specifically on floating and river use. Was there a conversation around any of the trash issues around the site, or use that may not be allowed or potentially dangerous? This question specifically mentions jumping off of the bridge, etc. Was that part of the study so far, or is that part of what's coming up when we're talking about the management of the site?
Yeah, those were not things that we specifically studied during the on-site data collection itself in terms of presence of litter or kind of non-conforming behaviors. However, those are, as you suggest, Melissa, topics that I think would be part of the conversation through the engagement process itself.
Great. And I think, this was an opportunity to kind of hear what information's been collected so far. And as Liza mentioned, if you have specific questions about additional information that would be useful as part of this conversation, that we can seek the answers to, that, we certainly encourage you to type that in the chat. We'll give you maybe a couple more minutes to do so. I want to recognize that some people in the chat have also mentioned the ecological components being a really important perspective to bring into the management conversation. So increased use, especially during COVID, that may potentially have impacts that we aren't aware of yet, and really being thoughtful about how use and visitor impacts can have on the ecological and natural resources of the area. And so that certainly is part of the reason the working group is set up the way that it is, that's really focused on bringing neighbors, commercial operators, land managers, as I mentioned, Parks and Wildlife, and different organizations who are part of the management of the site. The county, of course, will be part of those conversations, recreation users, all of those perspectives to one table to have really informed conversations, to share information and also to share perspectives about what might work, what concerns we're seeing in public land management and some of the trends that might exist. And so if we haven't answered your question today, it's not because they aren't important. It's, we may need more information to answer them, or it may be most appropriate to answer those as we get into the public facing process, the survey, the working groups, and the community meeting. So just encourage you, as I mentioned, all of your questions in the chat, but I do want to give over the last 10 minutes just to wrap us up and talk about next steps. Liza, I think that would mean turning it to you. Is that accurate? Okay, I'm seeing a couple head nods.
Thank you, Melissa. And you actually just said a lot of what I was going to say in terms of describing the working group and explaining that, we can't, part of public process is making effective conversations. And so we're trying to bring together that diverse group of people to take the data. And like I said, we have quite a bit of ecological data, and those reports are available. If people have specific questions or want to dig into it, those are already available on our website. So the most recent wildlife monitoring reports and vegetation reports, all the way back, as far back as we have them, and including some, we don't have, trends are hard to talk about in this setting right now. But I think that the point is that we have that ecological data, and thank you so much to this team. It was apparent 5 years ago that we didn't have a good data-driven approach or understanding of the visitor use component at North Star. And so again, thank you for digging in deep and providing that to us. It is one component of managing North Star, but it is the part that most people see and respond to. With most of the preserve closed, we don't see what's happening there. So this will sort of balance that out, and we can start to get into how to take this information and make some recommendations for inclusion in the draft management plan. So that will be, again, a lot of that will be happening in working group sessions, in facilitated focus groups, and in a more broad public surveys, to the point of like, we want to hear from the public that was not just floating the river. And that's part of our normal public process in doing management plan updates. So this was a survey of river users to fill that data gap, and we will go through a full public process to update this management plan this year. So I think that's about it. It's pretty wonderful to see so many invested people that are engaging in public process, and it's a challenging one, but I appreciate everyone for showing up and contributing now and into the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Liza. Thanks, everyone, for participating. We hope to see you at one of the upcoming meetings. Let us know if you have any further questions. Otherwise, we'll see you soon.
So.
Thanks, everybody.